Hello, listeners of Z Sci-Fi Stories. Thank you from the bottom of our hearts for tuning in today. Unfortunately, YouTube has completely disabled our monetization features, leaving us without the necessary budget to maintain our operations and pay our hardworking team for their daily lives. If you find today's story captivating and wish to support our continued creations, please consider donating just $1 to help us keep this channel alive. You can easily do so by scanning the PayPal QR code currently on your screen, or by clicking the PayPal link provided in the video description and the pinned comment below. Now, let us begin the journey. The stench of scorched ozone and rotting marrow clung to the rusted ventilation walls like a physical weight, suffocating and inescapable. Below the corroded iron grating, the butchers of Tartarus 9 were relentlessly at work, turning sentient alien life into market-value chemicals. It was a mechanized slaughterhouse, suspended in the freezing void, orbiting a massive planet composed entirely of volatile, toxic green clouds. And Dylan Brumfield was just trying to remain a shadow in the dark. Dylan pressed his grimy face against the freezing metal of the vent. His breath hissed softly through his clenched teeth, perfectly synchronized with the rhythmic, agonizing groans of the space station's failing structural supports. Inside the narrow shaft, the air was unbearably thick, heavy with the copper scent of spilled blood and the sharp, burning tang of industrial-grade antiseptics. The claustrophobia was absolute, pressing against his chest with every heartbeat. His left eye twitched violently, a painful side effect of his outdated neural combat implants, struggling against the facility's massive electromagnetic interference. He was a former mercenary, a broken man who had leased his trigger finger to ruthless corporate entities for decades. Right now, his only objective was to remain an undetected ghost in a galaxy that had long since lost its moral compass. Through the narrow, grease-stained slits of the grate, a waking nightmare unfolded on the processing floor directly beneath him. Under the harsh, flickering glare of chemical sodium lamps, corporate enforcers encased in heavy, blood-splattered hazard armor laughed loudly as they operated the mechanized sorting lines. Thick conveyor belts, slick with iridescent visceral fluids, carried the paralyzed, violently twitching bodies of exotic species ripped from a dozen different homeworlds. High-velocity mechanical saws whined with a deafening pitch, brutally biting through thick chitin and bone to harvest glowing organs, rare endocrine glands, and precious synthetic neurochemicals. It was an assembly line of pure, unadulterated cruelty, a towering monument to the absolute absence of corporate humanity. The enforcers carelessly tossed the discarded, empty husks into massive incineration chutes, sending the thick, nauseating smell of burning flesh wafting directly up into Dylan's cramped hiding spot. Then, the heavy blast doors at the far end of the cavernous chamber ground open with an ear-splitting screech. A massive, heavily armored transport drone hovered into the room, towing an electromagnetically sealed cage. The ambient noise of the room seemed to dip into an eerie silence as the enforcers eagerly gathered around their newest prize. Inside the reinforced enclosure knelt a creature of breathtaking, tragic beauty. She was strikingly humanoid in her proportions, but her delicate skin was covered in a complex lattice of crystalline scales that pulsed with a weak, fading bioluminescence. Her breath was incredibly shallow, her head bowed in quiet agony beneath the oppressive weight of the heavy magnetic suppression collar locked around her slender throat. Dylan's ocular implant automatically zoomed in, focusing on the digital auction tags flashing rapidly across the enforcer's handheld data pads. The reality of her situation settled into his stomach like a stone. They were not going to simply dissect her for individual parts. They were going to drain her alive. The corporate buyers had priced her for a complete spinal marrow extraction, a horrifyingly slow, agonizing procedure that would leave her conscious just long enough to feel every single second of her own hollow death. They called her kind a synthezoid, though Dylan did not know that specific name just yet. He only saw a terrified victim slated for the worst conceivable execution. As the lead butcher confidently approached the cage, hefting a massive hydraulic extraction needle, the glowing creature suddenly raised her head, her luminous eyes, swirling with a terrified silver light, frantically scanned the deep shadows of the high ceiling, and then, defying all logic, her gaze locked dead onto the exact pitch-black vent where Dylan was hiding. The physical distance between them was over 40 feet, but in an instant, that space vanished entirely. A sharp, freezing jolt pierced Dylan's skull, completely bypassing his auditory implants and drilling directly into his cerebral cortex. It was a weak, fractured telepathic projection, carrying the overwhelming sensation of absolute, crushing despair. Woven into that agonizing psychic static was a ragged, desperately whispering voice, pushing words directly into his mind. "Sold for meat, human. Hold me, use me, but get me out of here." The words struck him with the devastating force of a physical blow. His chest seized. For over 10 years, Dylan had perfected the cowardly art of looking the other way. He had stood silently on ruined, burning worlds, watching innocents be slaughtered, constantly telling himself it was not his contract, not his problem, and definitely not his fight. He had buried his conscience beneath thick layers of cynical survival instincts and cheap synthetic alcohol. But that shattered plea, that heartbreakingly desperate offer to trade away her very dignity and existence just to escape this immediate, visceral horror, tore right through his carefully constructed armor. The screaming ghosts of the countless people he had cowardly failed to save echoed violently in his ears, perfectly merging with the high-pitched whine of the butcher's hydraulic needle. He absolutely could not be a bystander. Not today. Never again. Dylan did not waste a single second considering the fatal odds. His scarred hands flew past the heavy pulse rifle slung across his back, reaching instead for a military-grade thermal detonator clamped securely to his tactical belt. Directly above the gathered enforcers' heads ran a primary, pressurized coolant pipe carrying superheated plasma meant for the incineration chutes. He rapidly set the digital timer for 2 seconds, kicked the rusted iron grate completely out of the wall, and dropped the explosive charge into the abyss. Dylan dove headfirst from the shaft just as the detonator blew. The resulting explosion violently ruptured the heavy pipe, sending a blinding, deafening geyser of white-hot plasma raining down onto the processing floor. The hazard-suited enforcers shrieked in absolute agony as the intense thermal shockwave knocked them violently off their feet, their advanced optical sensors instantly short-circuiting in the blinding white flash, landing heavily on a steel gantry. Dylan's reinforced mechanical knees absorbed the bone-jarring impact. He vaulted cleanly over the railing, plummeting directly into the chaotic, smoke-filled room. He fluidly drew his combat blade, a vibrating edge of razor-sharp monomolecular steel, and sprinted blindly through the thick, burning steam. He slid under the wildly swinging arm of a blinded drone, reached the glowing cage, and viciously slashed his blade straight through the magnetic lock interface. The heavy, reinforced doors hissed open. Dylan grabbed the glowing, fragile wrist of the crystalline woman, forcefully pulling her out of the blood-stained cage. He did not say a single word, and neither did she, as the space station's catastrophic red alarm klaxons finally began to wail, echoing endlessly through the burning slaughterhouse. Dylan dragged her into the pitch-black labyrinth of the sprawling scrap zone, leaving the screaming corporate butchers far behind in the smoke. Gravity vanished. The artificial plating beneath their boots died the second they crossed into the primary waste sector. Dylan kicked off a rusted bulkhead. He hauled the glowing woman with him. They sailed through a massive cylinder of floating debris. Frozen coolant formed deadly spikes in the air. Globs of toxic waste floated like dark jellyfish in the zero-gravity environment. Every movement required precise calculation. One wrong push meant drifting endlessly into the freezing dark. Red lasers sliced the darkness. Searing heat grazed Dylan's shoulder, burning right through his tactical armor. Drones. 3 hunter-killer units descended from the upper grates. Their twin rotary cannons spun up with a terrifying mechanical whine. "Move!" Dylan barked. He yanked her behind a floating slab of titanium hull plating. Sparks showered over them as heavy plasma rounds chewed the metal to pieces. They could not stay here. The drones flanked them. Target locks beeped continuously in the void. Dylan raised his pulse rifle. His combat implant glitched violently. Pain spiked behind his eyes, a sharp reminder of his degrading hardware. He pulled the trigger, but the recoil sent him spinning off balance. He missed entirely. The woman did not cower. She pushed off the barricade. She drifted directly into the open path of the lead drone. "Get down!" Dylan yelled. He reached out to grab her, but he was too slow. She ignored him completely. The crystalline scales along her spine ignited. It was not a weak pulse of light. It was a blinding, concentrated solar flare. The raw bioluminescence washed over the entire corridor. The drone's highly sensitive optical sensors overloaded instantly. Their glass lenses shattered with sharp, electrical pops. The machines spun wildly out of control, firing blindly into the walls before crashing violently into each other. A massive secondary explosion rocked the corridor, sending a wave of searing heat rushing past them. Dylan grabbed her arm tightly. They drifted fast through the expanding debris cloud. A massive blast door blocked the end of the shaft. It was sealed tight. A heavy biometric scanner glowed angrily in bright red. Dylan slammed his fist against the solid steel console. "We are trapped. I need heavy explosive charges." The woman drifted forward. She raised her right hand. Her delicate fingers elongated rapidly. The crystal-tipped nails hardened into razor-sharp data spikes. She plunged her hand straight into the biometric scanner. Sparks rained down her glowing arm. The raw bioelectric current from her body surged directly into the station's circuitry. The heavy blast doors groaned under the immense pressure. The red light flickered, then flipped to a solid green. "Inside!" she commanded. Her voice was no longer a fractured whisper. It was firm and clear. They tumbled into a decommissioned decontamination chamber. The door slammed shut behind them. The heavy locking mechanisms engaged with a deafening thud. Artificial gravity instantly reactivated, slamming them both onto the hard grated floor. Dylan gasped for air. His lungs burned furiously. He ripped open his tactical vest. The laser graze on his shoulder was completely cauterized, but the deep pain radiated down into his ribs. He pulled a military-grade stimulant patch from his belt. He slapped it onto his neck. His breathing steadied as the synthetic adrenaline flooded his veins. He looked up at the woman. She leaned heavily against the cold metal wall. Her bright glow had dimmed considerably. The massive energy expenditure had exhausted her physical reserves. "You are not just valuable corporate cargo," Dylan said. He wiped the cold sweat from his brow. "My designation is Vielle," she replied. She rubbed her delicate wrists, where the magnetic shackles had burned away her skin. "I am a synthezoid. First generation." Dylan froze. His blood ran instantly cold. The stimulant patch suddenly seemed to lose its potent effect. Synthezoid. That is a corporate myth, a ghost project discussed only in encrypted black market forums. "We are not ghosts," Vielle said. Her luminous eyes met his gaze directly. "We were engineered by the Zenith Corporation. We were designed specifically to be infinite biological batteries. They created our bodies to harvest and store dark matter energy. But they made a massive, fatal miscalculation. Our complex neural pathways evolved. We developed independent sentience. We felt the agonizing pain of the harvest. We felt absolute fear. Zenith Corporation." The name dropped into Dylan's stomach like a lead weight. For 10 long years, He had proudly worn their blood-soaked patch on his shoulder. He had burned down isolated rebel outposts for them. He had silenced desperate whistleblowers for them. He had gladly taken their credits to buy his own expensive cybernetic upgrades. He had paid for his violent life with the silent suffering of her people. He stared at his trembling hands. They suddenly felt soaked in invisible blood. This rescue mission was no longer a fleeting impulse of basic humanity. It was a terrifying, unavoidable mirror held up to his brutal past. The corporate hunters waiting outside were his former brothers in arms. This was no longer just about getting out of the station alive. It was a mandatory penance. He owed her his miserable life, and 1,000 more. "I used to work for them," Dylan confessed. His voice was entirely hollow, stripped of all its former confidence. "I took their credits. I did their dirty work." Vielle did not flinch in disgust. She simply tilted her head. "I know. I felt your fractured mind in the processing room. I saw your terrible sins. But I also saw your overwhelming regret. That is exactly why I chose you." Before Dylan could even process the heavy weight of her words, the chamber plunged into total darkness. The emergency backup lights flared a sickly crimson. The entire metal deck vibrated beneath their boots. A cold, synthesized female voice echoed from the overhead intercom. "Sector lockdown engaged. Unauthorized biological entities detected. Initiating purge protocol. Releasing the bloodhounds." Dylan snapped his rifle up. The crushing guilt vanished, instantly replaced by pure, crystallized adrenaline. The bloodhounds. They were biomechanical hunting dogs. They were half-starved timberwolf, half-titanium killing machine. They tracked the specific chemical markers of fear pheromones. They did not stop hunting until their designated prey was completely shredded. The heavy steel door began to vibrate violently. Deep, guttural snarls echoed loudly from the corridor outside. Metallic claws the size of combat knives scraped relentlessly against the reinforced metal. "They are manually overriding the door," Dylan said. He rapidly checked his remaining ammunition. "We absolutely cannot fight a pack of them in this tight space. They will tear us apart." "Then where do we go?" Vielle asked. She readied her crystal spikes, her body tensing for the inevitable fight. Dylan pointed down to the heavy, rusted maintenance hatch, welded directly into the floor plates. "Down. We bypass the main security decks entirely. We drop straight into the nuclear reactor core. The extreme radiation down there will completely mask your energy signature. It will fry their biological tracking sensors." "And what will that radiation do to us?" "It will melt our internal organs and kill us in exactly 2 hours if we do not find a hazardous material suit," Dylan replied grimly. He leveled his heavy rifle directly at the bulging main door. "But those mechanical hounds will kill us in less than 2 minutes. Start ripping that heavy hatch open." The thick blast door buckled violently inward. The steel hinges screamed in protest. "Now, Vielle, rip it open." Vielle dropped to her knees and drove her glowing hands deep into the tight seams of the floor hatch. The rusted metal shrieked as she pulled. Above them, the main door finally exploded inward in a shower of sparks and smoke. A massive, metallic beast lunged forward through the debris. Dylan held down the trigger. The descent into the maintenance bowels of Tartarus 9 felt like sinking into a mechanical grave. The deafening roar of the bloodhounds faded above them, replaced by the oppressive, humming silence of the station's lower levels. The air down here was stagnant, thick with the metallic taste of ozone, leaking coolant, and deep, forgotten decay. But the real nightmare was not outside in the dark corridors. It was manifesting inside Dylan's head. A sharp, blinding spike of static pierced his skull. Dylan collapsed heavily against the rusted grating of the catwalk, violently coughing up a mouthful of dark, oxygen-starved blood. His vision fractured into a terrifying kaleidoscope of digital artifacts and traumatic hallucinations. He saw the burning colonies of his past again. He heard the screaming children from a dozen ruined worlds echoing in the confined space. His outdated combat implant was malfunctioning severely, sparking uncontrollably against his cervical spine and flooding his nervous system with phantom pain. "Your neural hardware is degrading rapidly," Vial said softly, kneeling beside him in the suffocating dark. Her bioluminescence cast long, ghostly shadows across his pale, sweating face, offering the only source of light in the pitch-black maintenance shaft. "It is just the electromagnetic interference," Dylan choked out, wiping the thick blood from his chin with a trembling hand. "We need to find a functional communications terminal. I need to know exactly where the corporate security forces are deploying, or we will walk directly into a firing squad." He dragged himself toward a flickering, half-dismantled maintenance console embedded in the damp wall. His fingers, trembling violently from the neural feedback, bypassed the rusted security locks and tapped directly into the station's heavily encrypted radio frequency. The audio feed crackled to life, but it was not the panicked chatter of local enforcers hunting them. It was a high-level, strictly classified military broadcast. "Target acquired," a cold, automated voice declared over the static. "Zenith Dreadnought class vessel, designation Oblivion, is 3 minutes away from maximum orbital strike range. Primary corporate objective is absolute containment. Annihilate Tartarus 9. Leave 0 biological evidence. Erase all assets." Dylan stared at the flashing green text on the console, his blood running absolutely cold. They were not sending extraction teams. They were not trying to capture the escaped synthezoid. They were going to vaporize the entire space station and everyone on it. But then, a secondary data stream caught his augmented eye. It was a localized tracking ping, transmitting a steady, rhythmic pulse to the approaching warship. He forcefully decrypted the file, and the sheer horror of the revelation paralyzed his heart. The tracking signal was not coming from Vale. It was coming from the exact coordinates of his own cervical spine. "They let me take you," Dylan whispered, the horrifying truth crashing down on him with the weight of a dying star. The explosion, the escape from the slaughterhouse. It was all a calculated, cold-blooded setup. He turned to Vale, his eyes wide with a frantic, desperate paranoia. "My neural implant," Dylan gasped, gripping his head as another wave of phantom agony washed over him. "It is a deep cover locator beacon. Zenith knew I was a liability. They used my buried guilt against me. They wanted me to rescue you, so you would unknowingly lead me back to your hidden colony in the Outer Rim. I am not your savior, Vale. I am the bait that will exterminate your entire species." The heavy, crushing silence between them stretched into a suffocating eternity. The rusted walls of the corridor seemed to close in, crushing the very last remnants of Dylan's sanity. He unholstered his heavy pulse pistol. His scarred hands shook uncontrollably as he flipped the weapon around and pressed the cold, steel grip directly into Vile's hands. He grabbed her wrists and forced the heavy barrel directly against his own forehead. "Do it," Dylan ordered, his voice cracking with absolute, raw despair. "Squeeze the trigger. It is the only way to kill the transmitter. If they track me to your people, millions will die because of my stupidity. Kill me, Vale. You have to kill me right now." Vile looked down at the heavy weapon, then up at the broken, bleeding man begging for his own execution. She felt the chaotic storm of his guilt, his profound self-hatred, and his genuine desire to protect her kind at the cost of his own miserable life. She did not raise the gun. Instead, she gently pushed the barrel aside, letting it clatter to the metal floor. She stepped intimately close to him, her glowing eyes filled with a profound, incomprehensible sorrow. "I am done being a tool for death," she whispered. She placed her delicate, crystalline fingers directly against the base of his neck, right over the pulsing cybernetic implant. A sharp, stinging sensation flooded Dylan's nervous system. Vile secreted a highly specialized, conductive neurotoxin from her fingertips, pushing it straight through his skin and into the microscopic circuitry. The metallic hum in his skull screeched once, then died completely. The agonizing pressure vanished, leaving behind a shocking, peaceful silence. "The signal is paralyzed," Vial said, her internal light dimming significantly from the intense biological effort. "It is a temporary fix, but the Zenith Corporation is completely blind for now." Dylan fell to his knees, utterly astounded. She had every logical, survival-based reason to pull that trigger and end his life. Instead, she offered him absolute grace. That single act of impossible forgiveness forged an unbreakable, profound bond in the suffocating dark of the dead station. "We are not hiding anymore," Dylan said, rising slowly to his feet, a dangerous, renewed fire burning fiercely in his chest. "We are going down to the primary core. We will use the mass driver to punch a reinforced cargo pod straight out of this cursed solar system." They descended further into the true heart of the station, finally stepping through the heavy blast doors into the mass driver chamber. The scale of the room was utterly terrifying. A cavernous, zero-gravity cathedral built for industrial slaughter and cosmic physics. At its center hung the driver, a colossal magnetic cannon vibrating with the deep, guttural roar of harnessed dark matter. The sheer size of the machinery made them look like insignificant dust mites standing before an angry, mechanical god. But as the ambient emergency lighting flickered over the massive core structure, the true, horrifying nature of the machine was starkly revealed. Vial gasped, floating backward until her back hit the cold steel bulkhead. Surrounding the dark matter reactor in a massive, spinning halo were thousands of transparent cryogenic suspension pods. Inside, each pod was a fully grown synthezoid. They were hooked directly into the reactor core by thick, invasive neural cables drilled straight into their skulls. They were not dead. They were trapped in a state of agonizing, perpetual stasis, their collective consciousness being mercilessly siphoned to calculate the massive quantum equations required to keep the dark matter stable. "It is a battery built of screaming minds," Vial cried out, her voice trembling with raw, unfiltered terror as she stared at the endless rows of her imprisoned people. "My brothers, my sisters. They are powering this terrible weapon with their endless, waking torture." "Can you bypass the security locks?" Dylan asked, forcefully, pushing his horror aside and keeping his rifle raised as he scanned the towering darkness above them. "To initiate a manual launch sequence, I have to interface directly with the central processing node," she replied, her face pale and her bioluminescence flickering erratically. "I have to connect my mind to theirs. I will feel everything they are feeling, all the pain, all at once." "Do it," Dylan said softly, checking his ammunition reserves. "I will hold the line. Nobody gets past me." Vial floated upward toward the massive central terminal, extending her glowing data spikes into the primary access port. The exact moment she made physical contact, she let out a blood-curdling, psychic scream. The unimaginable agony of thousands of tortured souls flooded her fragile mind, lighting her body up like a dying, brilliant star. Simultaneously, the reinforced titanium ceiling far above them shattered violently inward. A Zenith Elite Black Operations team fast roped down through the falling, zero-gravity debris, their heavy tactical armor absorbing the impact as they magnetically clamped their boots to the walls. Dylan did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. He threw 2 homemade thermal charges toward the descending ropes, incinerating the first wave of soldiers in a blinding, expanding globe of white phosphorus. He dove behind a heavy titanium support strut, trading brutal, suppressed pulse fire with the remaining heavily armed enforcers. The vacuum of the room filled with the chaotic flashes of laser fire and the sharp, burning smell of vaporized metal. "Dylan!" Vial screamed over the chaotic, deafening gunfire, her voice laced with agonizing pain. The cargo pod can generate a temporary slip-space fold when fired from the cannon, but the navigation parameters are completely locked. The station's artificial intelligence has heavily encrypted the jump coordinates. Dylan slammed a fresh thermal magazine into his rifle, blind firing around the thick pillar to keep the highly trained soldiers pinned down. "How do we unlock the navigation?" Vielle looked down at him from the terminal, tears of glowing silver fluid streaming down her face as she fought the collective agony of her species. "The only way to calculate the slip-space jump is to download the station's raw navigation data directly into a biological processor. I cannot do it. My neural pathways are already completely saturated just holding the dark matter core open." The horrific realization hit Dylan like a physical blow to the chest. A biological processor. "My implant!" Dylan yelled, ducking hard as a heavy plasma round melted the very edge of his titanium cover, splashing hot slag across his boots. "You have to route the artificial intelligence directly into my cerebral port." "No!" Vielle screamed back, desperately trying to maintain the volatile connection to the core. "That is several petabytes of raw, unfiltered quantum data. It will overwhelm your nervous system. It will literally boil your cerebral fluid. It will melt your brain inside your skull." "We have exactly 2 minutes before a Zenith dreadnought blows this entire station into cosmic dust," Dylan roared back, violently throwing his very last explosive trap at the flanking soldiers. "Do it." Dylan abandoned the last semblance of his cover. He sprinted blindly through the deadly crossfire, his boots slipping on the blood-slicked grating. He reached the primary control terminal and grabbed the thick, braided fiber optic cable dangling from the main console. He did not hesitate for a single breath. He slammed the heavy, metallic connector directly into the raw neural port at the base of his skull. Reality instantly shattered. The station's artificial intelligence dumped petabytes of raw, compressed quantum data straight into his fragile human cortex. The sheer volume of the information was a physical assault. It was not just the complex slip-space jump coordinates required for the mass driver. It was the entire black ledger of the Zenith Corporation. Millions of heavily encrypted and suppressed files, illegal genetic blueprints, the exact coordinates of the hidden synthezoid colonies, and decades of meticulously covered-up planetary genocides flashed behind his eyelids in a single, agonizing fraction of a second. His nervous system violently overloaded. He collapsed hard onto the metal floor. His muscles seized in a terrifying, rigid convulsion. Thick, dark blood immediately poured from his tear ducts, blinding him completely. His nose bled profusely, painting his chin in crimson. He screamed in absolute agony. But the raw sound was entirely drowned out by the roaring machinery of the awakening mass driver core. High above them, the massive reinforced blast shutters of the observatory dome rapidly retracted. The infinite, star-studded blackness of space was suddenly and completely eclipsed. The Zenith dreadnought had arrived. It was a floating, metallic mountain of death. A warship so impossibly massive, it blotted out an entire quadrant of the universe. Along its jagged, heavily armored ventral spine, the primary orbital laser cannons began to charge. A terrifying, blinding crimson light gathered deep within the muzzles, perfectly locked onto the structural heart of Tartarus 9. "The coordinates are locked in," Dylan gasped, forcefully spitting out a mouthful of blood. He blindly reached out into the empty air. Vielle caught his trembling hand. She disengaged her glowing data spikes from the tortured network, her beautiful bioluminescence flickering weakly, almost depleted. She hauled his heavily convulsing body across the zero-gravity chamber toward the massive launch cradle. Resting securely on the enormous magnetic rails was an industrial ore transport pod, forged from ultra-dense, depleted uranium designed to survive catastrophic atmospheric re-entry. They threw themselves inside the cramped, freezing interior of the heavy metal shell. Vielle slammed her glowing palm against the emergency pneumatic seal. The heavy, blast-proof vault door hissed and locked shut with a deafening, final thud. Outside the reinforced viewing port of the pod, the dreadnought fired its very first calibrating shot. The silent, brilliant beam of pure, destructive thermal energy struck the upper processing decks. Over half of the massive space station was instantly vaporized into a cloud of glowing, molten slag. The sheer kinetic shockwave hurled the heavy pod violently against its magnetic restraints, tossing Dylan and Vale against the hard, padded walls. Inside the dark, claustrophobic cabin, the launch sequence display lit up in bright green, loudly counting down from 10, 9, 8, 7. Then, the digital screen flashed violently to a deep, angry red. The countdown froze completely at 3 seconds. A cold, synthesized alarm echoed inside the tight confines of the pod. Launch sequence aborted. Primary control overridden by external administrative command. Dylan's back arched violently against the cold metal floor. His eyes snapped wide open, but his pupils were completely dilated, turning pitch black and glassy. The Zenith Corporation had finally adapted. They had completely bypassed Vale's temporary neurotoxin block. The Dreadnought's massive, military-grade transmitter array was actively broadcasting a brute force, high-frequency override signal straight through the hull and directly into his cybernetic cervical implant. He was no longer just a passive tracking device. He was a living, breathing human firewall. Zenith was actively using his hijacked, bleeding nervous system as a physical encryption key to completely lock down the mass driver's firing mechanism from the inside. He could not move his arms. He could not turn his head. He could not even blink. He was an absolute prisoner, locked inside the suffocating cage of his own skull. Through the thick glass of the pod, he watched helplessly as the Dreadnought's main weapon array reached 100% charge capacity. Death was now measured in mere milliseconds. If that laser fired, vile, the stolen data, and the very last hope for an entire innocent species would be incinerated into cosmic ash. His corporate puppet masters held his body completely hostage, perfectly calculating that a mere human could never break their advanced digital chains. But they had fundamentally misjudged the sheer depth of a broken man's frantic desire for redemption. His mechanical right hand, an older, heavily analog titanium prosthetic that the wireless corporate signal could not fully suppress, began to twitch through an act of pure, agonizing willpower that literally tore the remaining organic muscle fibers in his shoulder. Dylan forced his metal fingers down to his tactical belt. He wrapped his cold grip firmly around the heavily serrated, monomolecular steel of his combat knife. He knew exactly what he had to do, and it was going to be the most brutally terrifying decision of his entire violent existence. Dylan's analog prosthetic hand trembled violently as it gripped the heavy, serrated hilt of his combat knife. The digital paralysis enforced by the Zenith Corporation gripped every single organic nerve in his body, turning his own muscles into heavy chains of lead. But the cold, titanium servos of his right arm, a crude and ancient piece of machinery built long before the current era of wireless corporate subjugation, operated on a completely different physical wavelength. It was a terrifyingly slow, agonizing process. Every single millimeter he raised, the blade felt like moving a mountain. His teeth ground together so hard, his gums bled. He forced the razor-sharp, monomolecular edge of the steel directly against the base of his own neck, right where the cold metal of the cybernetic implant fused with his human flesh. He did not hesitate. He did not grant himself the luxury of fear. With one final, barbaric surge of pure willpower, Dylan drove the heavy blade deep into his own flesh. He did not just sever the wires. He brutally twisted the knife, purposefully carving out the entire localized network of corrupted microchips, forcefully taking a significant portion of his own upper spinal cord along with it. A horrifying combination of biological crunch and electrical popping echoed in the tight confines of the pod. Bright blue sparks of dying machinery mixed freely with the dark crimson spray of arterial blood. The oppressive, suffocating digital noise inside his mind vanished instantly. The terrifying presence of the Zenith Corporation was forcefully evicted from his skull, leaving behind an absolute, stunning void. But the brutal self-mutilation exacted the ultimate physical price. The cybernetic implant had completely regulated his autonomic nervous system for over a decade. As the crushed machinery fell from his bleeding neck, his heavily scarred heart simply ceased to beat. His lungs stopped drawing air. Dylan collapsed face first onto the cold metal deck of the pod, utterly motionless, drowning in a rapidly expanding pool of his own blood. Above the control console, the digital launch parameter screen instantly flipped from a locked, angry red to a brilliant, welcoming green. The living firewall was dead. The heavy mass driver was fully unlocked. Vile did not scream. She threw her glowing body forward and slammed her hand down onto the primary launch initiator exactly 1 millisecond before the Dreadnought's orbital laser breached the station's outer hull. The raw, unadulterated kinetic force of the mass driver core violently slammed into the base of the heavy transport pod. The sheer acceleration was beyond anything the human body was ever meant to endure. In less than a single breath, the reinforced vessel was propelled from absolute zero to the speed of light. Outside the heavy viewing port, the fabric of the universe screamed. The pod tore a violent, jagged rift straight through the localized dimensions of normal space, ripping open a temporary slipspace fold right across the massive bow of the Zenith warship. Behind them, the Dreadnought's primary weapon discharged. A beam of pure, localized sunfire struck the volatile dark matter reactor of Tartarus 9. The resulting explosion did not just destroy the space station. It briefly ignited the dark void with a blinding, spherical shockwave of catastrophic energy, vaporizing millions of tons of metal and bone into subatomic dust. But the heavy transport pod was already gone, slipping through the dimensional crack and vanishing entirely into the great unknown, leaving the violent, burning wrath of the corporation millions of light-years behind. The violent kinetic shaking stopped completely. The deafening roar of the launch was instantly replaced by a silence so profound, so absolute. It felt like standing in the great halls of eternity. The slipspace jump concluded. The heavy titanium shutters shielding the pod's main viewport slowly retracted. They were adrift in the gentle, endless currents of a breathtaking, uncharted nebula. Massive clouds of swirling violet and gold cosmic dust stretched across the infinite horizon, cradling the tiny, scarred metal pod in the quiet majesty of deep space. It was a realm untouched by corporate greed, unblemished by the rust and blood of the slaughterhouse. It was the purest definition of freedom. But inside the freezing cabin, the silence was a tomb. Vile drifted down to the floor in the zero-gravity environment. She gently pulled Dylan's lifeless, bleeding body into her arms. His face was entirely pale, his eyes closed, his chest completely still. He had sacrificed his own existence to grant her an escape he fundamentally believed he did not deserve. "You do not get to die in the dark," Vile whispered, her voice echoing softly in the quiet metal room. "Not after giving me the light." She pressed her chest directly against his. She closed her eyes and reached deep into the very core of her synthesized being. She gathered every single remaining ounce of her internal bioluminescence, the very cosmic energy she was engineered to generate. Her crystalline scales ignited one final, magnificent time, turning the dark interior of the pod into a blinding sphere of pure, silver radiance. She pushed that raw, life-giving energy straight through his ruined chest cavity, directly into his dead heart and heavily damaged brain. It was not a medical procedure. It was a complete transference of life force. As the energy flowed into him, Her own brilliant light began to rapidly fade, leaving her crystalline skin looking like ordinary, fragile glass. A sudden, violent gasp shattered the silence. Dylan's back arched sharply. His chest heaved as his lungs desperately pulled in the cold, recycled air of the cabin. He coughed weakly, his eyes fluttering open to see the magnificent, swirling violet nebula framed through the glass above them. He reached a trembling, purely organic hand up to the back of his neck. He felt deep, agonizing pain. He felt torn muscle and healing bone. But he did not feel cold metal. The intrusive, humming machinery that had chained his soul for 10 long years was completely gone. The phantom voices of the corporate handlers were silent. He was hurting, he was broken. But for the first time in his adult life, he was entirely, undeniably human. Vile leaned back, her glow reduced to a soft, barely visible pulse beneath her skin. She looked exhausted, but a profound, genuine smile graced her lips. She reached out and gently took his trembling hand. It was not the desperate, clinging grasp of a terrified slave begging to be used for survival. It was the firm, warm hold of a completely free companion, standing on equal ground in the vastness of the universe. Dylan squeezed her hand back. Deep within his newly liberated organic mind rested petabytes of classified Zenith data. He held the exact coordinates of her hidden people. He held the absolute proof of the corporation's worst atrocities. They were alone, drifting through an unknown sea of stars. But they were no longer hunted prey. They were the burning spark that would ignite a revolution. They held the ultimate weapon, and they were finally going to bring the Empire crashing down. The endless, quiet dark of the universe embraced them. Thank you so much to all of our wonderful listeners for joining us on this incredible journey today. We would love to know where you are listening from, so please drop your city or country in the comments below. If you felt the thrill and emotion of today's story and want to help us keep this channel alive, we humbly ask for your support. A simple donation of just $1 makes a massive difference. It allows us to pay our dedicated writers and voice actors, helping them feed their families and continue creating the vast, exciting worlds you love to hear. You can support us right now by scanning the PayPal QR code on your screen, or by clicking the PayPal link provided in the video description and the pinned comment. Until our next adventure across the stars, stay safe and keep looking up.